The gun was already on the table between them when Benjamin Ralston said it. Mae Donnelly had not moved since he spoke the words. She sat perfectly still across from him in the low amber light of the ranch house kitchen, the smell of wood smoke and something baking in the cast-iron stove wrapping around both of them like a secret they hadn't agreed to share. Her hands were flat on the rough-hewn table, fingers spread, as if she needed to feel something solid beneath her because the ground had just shifted in a way she could not name. The gun was there, steel gray and ugly, and it belonged to the man who had sent her here under false pretenses, the man whose letter had promised a respectable position and whose motives had turned out to be anything but respectable. That man was not in this room. That man was somewhere outside in the dark Colorado night, and he was looking for her. But Benjamin Ralston, whose eyes were the particular color of river water in late September, whose hands were large and scarred from years of honest work, whose voice had just said the most disarming thing she had ever heard a man say in her 26 years of living, was looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had never spoken aloud. "I think I have been waiting for you specifically," he said again, quieter this time, as if saying it twice confirmed it for him rather than for her. Mae felt something crack open in her chest. Not break, not shatter, because breaking implied destruction. This was different. This was the way a seed cracks open in the dark earth right before it begins to grow towards something it cannot yet see. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. That had always been her gift and her curse. "You don't know who I am, what I've done, or why I'm really here." "No," he agreed. He did not look away. "But I intend to." Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance. Both of them heard it. Both of them knew what it meant. The man who had brought Mae Donnelly to Cortez, Colorado, under a web of lies and hidden motives, was closing in, and there was a gun on the table between two people who had known each other for less than 6 hours, and somehow, impossibly, this moment felt more real to me than anything that had come before it in a very long time. Let me tell you how they got here. The year was 1882. The Denver and Rio Grande Railway had only recently pushed its narrow-gauge tracks through the rugged southwestern corner of Colorado, threading through canyons and across dry mesas that the Ute people had known for centuries before any railroad man ever laid eyes on them. The town of Cortez sat at the edge of what most called the frontier, though the Ute would have told you, if anyone had bothered to ask them, that this land had never been without civilization. It was simply without theirs now. The injustice of that displacement sat heavy in the soil, in the silence at the edge of town, in the careful eyes of those who remembered what had been lost. But Cortez was growing regardless, as frontier towns do, pulling in ranchers and merchants and dreamers and desperate people who needed a new start or a place to hide their old lives. Mae Donnelly had been born in St. Louis, Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher mother who died of fever when Mae was 12 and a father who had sold books out of a small shop on Olive Street until debt consumed the shop and then, slowly, consumed him too. By the time Mae was 20, her father was gone, the shop was gone, and she had spent 4 years learning that the world offered women of modest means a very narrow set of doors to walk through. She had worked as a seamstress, then as a shop girl, then as a schoolteacher herself in a small town east of the Missouri River, where the winters were brutal and the pay was insulting, and the men who ran the school board looked at her with proprietary eyes that made her feel like an object to be evaluated rather than a person to be respected. She had answered the advertisement in the autumn of 1881 because she was tired. Not tired of life. She was not that far gone, but tired of smallness, tired of a world that kept contracting around her until she could barely breathe. The advertisement had been placed in 3 different newspapers by a man named Gerald Fitch, who described himself as a businessman and landowner in Cortez, Colorado, who needed a capable woman to manage his household accounts and correspondence, a position of genuine responsibility and respectable wages. He had written to her twice after she responded, letters that were charming and professional, and exactly calibrated to appeal to an intelligent woman who valued independence. She had told herself she was being sensible and practical. She had not let herself hope for anything more than a decent wage and a new place to be. She arrived in Cortez on a Tuesday afternoon in early April of 1882, stepping off the train into the high desert air that smelled like juniper and red dust, and something she could not name, something wild and enormous and indifferent to her, the land itself breathing. Gerald Fitch had been there to meet her. He was 45, with the look of a man who had once been handsome and knew it, gray at the temples, eyes that moved too quickly across her face, and then down, and then back up in a way that made her want to button her coat to the throat even though the afternoon was warm. He had taken her to his house, which was large and recently built and full of new furniture that spoke of money spent in a hurry, the kind of money that announces itself loudly because it is trying to drown something out. He had shown her the office where she would work, the books she would manage, the desk with its neat piles of correspondence. Everything had seemed legitimate. And then he had shown her to a room upstairs and explained, with a smile that did not reach his cold gray eyes, that her room was adjacent to his, and that his understanding of the position had always been rather more personal than his advertisement may have conveyed. Mae had listened to him finish speaking. She had kept her face still and her hands relaxed at her sides even as everything inside her went cold and calculating. Then she had said, very pleasantly, that she needed to unpack and freshen up from the journey, that she would join him for supper, and that she looked forward to discussing the full scope of her responsibilities at that time. She had gone upstairs. She had not unpacked. She had taken the small amount of cash she kept sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, and she had gone to the window and looked out at the unfamiliar town and felt, for just a moment, the full weight of how alone she was, more than 1,000 miles from anywhere she had ever known, trapped in a house with a man whose intentions were predatory and whose power in this small community was likely considerable. She had found the back stairs and used them. She had walked down a side street in the early evening light, carrying her bag, keeping her pace measured so as not to draw attention, moving through a town she did not know, looking for a hotel or a boarding house or any place that was not Gerald Fitch's house. She had found a general store that was still open and asked the woman behind the counter, a wide, practical woman named Mrs. Harlan, if she knew of a boarding house that was reputable and affordable. Mrs. Harlan had looked at her with the particular sharpness of a woman who understood, without being told, what certain kinds of questions meant. "You're the woman Fitch brought in on the train," she had said, not unkindly. "I was," Mae had said. "I am no longer employed by Mr. Fitch." Something had passed between them in the silence. Mrs. Harlan had said, "The widow Patton takes in boarders on Mesa Street. Tell her I sent you." Mae had thanked her and gone to find the widow Patton, and the widow Patton had given her a room on the second floor with a window that looked east toward a vast dark landscape that was still and enormous and beautiful in the last of the day's light. Mae had sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, to be afraid for approximately 10 minutes. Then she had put the fear away and begun to think practically about what came next. What came next was the morning, and with the morning came Gerald Fitch's realization that she was gone, and with that came his fury, which was the kind of fury that belongs to men who are accustomed to having their desires go unchallenged. Mae spent the next 2 days carefully. She ate her meals at the small dining room of the widow Patton's boarding house. She asked careful questions about the town, about who was honest and who was not, about what opportunities might exist for a woman who could read and write and keep accounts. She learned that Cortez was a cattle and farming community, that the land south and west of town was being settled by ranchers at a rapid pace, that there was a school that desperately needed a teacher, and that Gerald Fitch was known as a man who conducted business in ways that made other men uncomfortable, but that no one had yet found a way to successfully challenge. She also learned on the afternoon of the second day, from a young man who worked at the livery stable and who volunteered information freely and without guile, that Gerald Fitch had been asking around town about her, that he had told several people she had run off with something that belonged to him, which was a lie but a clever one, and that he had a particular associate, a hired man who was not kind, who was making inquiries. Mae had gone back to her room and thought about this for a long time. It was on the afternoon of that second day, while she was sitting in the small parlor of the widow Patton's house, reading one of the 3-month-old newspapers that were available there, that the door opened, and a man came in who ducked his head slightly to clear the frame, not because he was dangerously tall, but because he was in the habit of being careful about thresholds. He had removed his hat as he came inside. He had dust on his coat and on the knees of his trousers from a long ride. He spoke to the widow Patton about some business concerning a fence line and a survey, and the widow Patton pulled out a piece of paper, and the two of them discussed it in the way of people who have known each other a long time and trust each other's word completely. Mae had watched him from behind her newspaper without meaning to. He was perhaps 30, no more than 32, with dark hair that curled slightly where it met the back of his collar, and a face that was weathered but not hardened, the face of a man who spent his life outdoors but who had not let the outdoors make him cruel. His hands, when he signed the paper the widow Patton produced, were careful and sure. There was a quality to him that she noticed before she had words for it, a kind of deliberate gentleness, the kind that is not weakness but is instead the choice of a man strong enough to choose it. The widow Patton had introduced them. "Mr. Ralston, this is Miss Donnelly, who is newly arrived in town." He had turned and looked at her with those river-colored eyes, and he had said, "Miss Donnelly," and nothing more, but the way he said her name was not perfunctory. It was as if he was storing it somewhere careful. "Mr. Ralston," she had said. He had held her gaze for a moment longer than convention required, and then looked back at the widow Patton and completed his business and left. Mae had told herself this meant nothing, and had believed it for approximately 4 hours, until the widow Patton, over supper that evening, mentioned in the conversational, unhurried way of a woman who has learned that the best information is delivered sideways, that Benjamin Ralston ran the Sweetwater Ranch 12 miles south of town, that he had built it himself over 8 years from a single quarter section into one of the most productive cattle operations in the area, that he was known to be fair to the hands he hired and to the neighbors he dealt with, and that he was the kind of man who read books, which the widow Patton seemed to consider a definitive indicator of character. "He lost his wife 3 years ago," the widow Patton had added, serving herself more beans in a manner that conveyed this was simply information and not suggestion. "Fever. He's been alone out there since." Mae had said she was sorry to hear it and had meant it and had thought no more about Benjamin Ralston that night, or so she told herself. The next morning, Gerald Fitch's hired man found her. She was coming out of the general store where Mrs. Harlan had been kind enough to help her address an urgent letter to a friend in St. Louis, when a man stepped out of the shadows beside the building, a lean man with a face like a closed fist, who said her name in a flat way that was not a greeting. "Mr. Fitch would like a word," the man said. "I am not available to Mr. Fitch," Mae said. The man took a step toward her, and Mae did not step back, because she had learned that stepping back was the thing that invited pursuit, and she held her bag in front of her and looked at him with steady eyes and said, "This is a public street in the middle of the day." The man looked at her for a long moment with the calculating patience of someone who deals in patience as a form of threat. "Evening comes," he said, and walked away. Mae went directly back to the widow Patton's house and sat down and thought very carefully about what resources she actually had and what she needed to do. She had enough money to stay at the boarding house for perhaps 2 more weeks, not enough to buy a train ticket back to anywhere that felt safe, and even if she left, she had nothing waiting for her except the smallness she had fled. She had a letter she just mailed that would take days to receive any response to. She had the general store woman's goodwill and the widow Patton's roof, and neither of those, kind as they were, constituted protection against a man like Gerald Fitch. She was still thinking through this with systematic thoroughness when the widow Patton appeared in the doorway of the parlor and said, "Benjamin Ralston is here. He says he has business in town and wondered if you and I might join him for supper at the hotel dining room this evening." Me looked up. "He's never asked such a thing before," the widow Patton added, in her informational way. Me had said yes, because she was a practical woman and supper at the hotel dining room was a public place and good company in a town where she was running short of allies was not a thing to turn away from, and she told herself that was the only reason. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment in Cortez, which meant it had tablecloths that were only slightly uneven and a cook who had once worked in Denver and who produced a beef roast that was genuinely excellent. They sat at a round table near the window, the three of them, and Benjamin Ralston was quietly and attentively good company. He asked the widow Patton about her son who was farming north of town. He asked me, carefully and without prying, how she found the country, and listened to her answer with the kind of listening that most people don't bother with. She told him about the train journey through the canyon country and how the scale of it had surprised her, how she had pressed her face to the window like a child, because the red cliffs were so extraordinary. He smiled at that, and the smile changed his face considerably. He told her about the land south of town, about the mesa country and the juniper, and the way the light fell across the distant mountains in the evening. He talked about cattle and about the grass, and about the water rights that were becoming a source of contention among the newer ranchers. He talked about these things in the measured way of a man who loved what he did without needing to make it dramatic. Toward the end of the meal, when the widow Patton had excused herself briefly, Benjamin Ralston had looked across the table at me and said quietly, "Mrs. Harlan mentioned you might be in a difficult situation." Me held his gaze. "Mrs. Harlan is perceptive. She is." He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. "I don't want to presume, but if there's something that could be done, I'd want to know." "Why?" Me said. She said it directly because indirection seemed wasteful when the stakes were this concrete. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Because you came to this town under false pretenses that weren't your doing," he said at last, "and because you're clearly capable and sensible, and because what Fitch does to people in this community has been sitting wrong with me for a long time, and because I have a ranch that needs someone to manage its books and correspondence, and I've been doing it myself badly for 3 years. Me looked at him. "That's a very practical list of reasons." "I'm a practical man," he said. "Mostly." The widow Patton came back, and the conversation moved to other things, but me spent the rest of the evening and the walk back to the boarding house and the first hour in her room thinking about that word, mostly. She had said she would think about his offer. She had not told him she was already close to certain she would accept it, because she wanted to be sure that her certainty was practical and not something else. She lay in the dark with the Colorado night pressing cool and enormous outside her window and tried to sort herself out, and what she found when she was honest was that both things were true simultaneously. It was a practical arrangement, and it was also something else that she couldn't name yet and wasn't sure she wanted to name. In the morning she had sent a note to the Sweetwater Ranch with the livery boy, saying she would be glad to discuss the position further if he came to town that afternoon. He had come. They had sat in the widow Patton's parlor with the door open in the manner that propriety required and discussed terms. The wages were fair, considerably fairer than she had expected. The arrangement would be that she would manage the ranch's accounts and correspondence, with a room in the ranch house that was in a separate wing from his own quarters, with the full understanding that this was an employment arrangement, and nothing beyond that unless something changed by the mutual choice of both parties, which he said in a straightforward way that made clear he had thought about it carefully and wanted there to be no ambiguity. He said she would have her own income and her own standing, and no one would have any cause to look at her situation as anything less than respectable. She had agreed. They had shaken hands. His grip was firm and brief and honest. "I should tell you," he had said, just before she left to pack her things, "that Gerald Fitch is going to be unhappy about this." "I know," she had said. "I've dealt with Fitch before," he had said, and the way he said it was not threatening but was simply the statement of a man who has navigated difficult situations before and expects to do so again. She had been at the Sweetwater Ranch for 4 days when everything came to a head. Those 4 days were extraordinary in the quiet way that certain things are extraordinary before you understand that they are going to matter for the rest of your life. The ranch house was solid and worn in the way of things that have served their purpose for years without pretension. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and coffee. The office was a small room off the main hall with a window that looked south toward a mesa that turned purple in the late afternoon. The books were exactly as bad as he had warned her. 3 years of accounts kept by a man who understood cattle completely and bookkeeping minimally. And she had fallen into the work with the pleasure of someone putting a complicated thing to rights. She saw Benjamin Ralston at meals, which they took together because the alternative was him eating alone at one end of a long table, and her eating alone in the kitchen, and both of those things seemed unnecessarily lonely. They talked over breakfast about the day's work, over supper about whatever came up, and sometimes in the evenings she sat in the main room with a book, and he sat across from her reading the newspaper or the agricultural reports he received by mail, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that feels like rest rather than absence. She learned in those 4 days that he had come to Colorado from Ohio when he was 22 with $200 and a plan that was mostly ambition and partly stubbornness. That he had worked for 2 years for an older rancher named Hartley who had taught him everything about cattle and land. That he had bought his first quarter section at 24 and built the first part of the ranch house with his own hands that summer. That he had married a woman named Clara who had been brave and funny and generous, and who had died of typhoid in the summer of 1879 when their daughter was 2 years old. She learned this last part from a photograph on the mantel in the main room, a woman with a direct gaze and a slight smile, and from a small grave marker on a low hill east of the house that she had noticed on her second morning when she was taking a walk before breakfast. She had not asked about it directly. She had mentioned the hill carefully, and he had said, "Clara is buried there," in a way that was both matter-of-fact and full of something that had settled into him the way grief does when it has become part of the structure of a person rather than an acute wound. "And your daughter?" Mae had asked. "Ruth is with Clara's parents in Denver," he had said. "She was too small to manage out here alone after her mother died. She comes in the summers." He had paused. "She's 5 now." Mae had thought about this child on a hill in Denver, and about this man managing this place alone, and about the photograph on the mantel, and had felt a complicated tenderness that she kept at a careful distance because it was not yet hers to feel. On the morning of the 5th day, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Casper who was 20 years old and earnest, came in at breakfast with the look of someone carrying bad news. "There's men from Fitch's place on the South Road," Casper said. "3 of them, asking about Miss Donnelly." Benjamin Ralston set down his coffee cup. His face did not change much, but something in his eyes went very clear and still. "How far?" "Couple miles, maybe less," Casper said. Benjamin had looked at me across the table, and me had looked back at him, and in that particular look she had understood that whatever was going to happen next was going to require both of them to be very clear about where they stood. "Go inside the house," Benjamin told Casper. "Get Tom and Harris and tell them to come in armed but calm. Tell them not to start anything unless it's started first." He had also, moving through the kitchen with the efficient quiet of someone managing a serious situation, taken the spare revolver from the cabinet by the back door and put it on the kitchen table. He had looked at her. "Do you know how to use one?" "Yes," she had said, because her father had believed women should be able to protect themselves and had taught her, which was one of the things she had loved about him. He had nodded once. "Good. and then he had gone out to meet the men on the road. She had watched from the window as Benjamin Ralston walked out to where 3 men on horses had stopped in his yard. One of them the lean man with the face like a closed fist who had threatened her on the street in town. And she had watched the conversation, which lasted perhaps 10 minutes, and in which Benjamin stood with his thumbs in his pockets in a posture that was absolutely relaxed and absolutely unmoving, and at the end of which the 3 men turned their horses and rode back down the south road. He had come back inside and poured himself more coffee. "What did you say to them?" Mae had asked. "I told them that you're employed here, that your employment is legal and voluntary, that you have no obligation to any arrangement with Gerald Fitch, and that if they came back onto my property without an invitation, I would be presenting that fact to the county sheriff, along with a formal complaint about harassment." He had sipped his coffee. "I also mentioned that I own 3/4 of the water rights on the South Fork of the creek that Fitch's newest pasture depends on, and that water rights are a matter of recorded law, and that I am on very good terms with the clerk who maintains those records." Mae had stared at him. "That's quite a negotiating position." "Fitch respects leverage," Benjamin had said. "He doesn't understand much else." That had been the morning. This now was the evening. The men had been gone all day, but Casper had come in an hour ago to say that a single rider had been spotted on the North Ridge in the late afternoon, just watching and then gone. And somehow that single rider watching and then going felt more threatening than the 3 men in the yard had, because the 3 men in the yard had been a confrontation, and this was surveillance, and surveillance meant planning. And planning meant that Gerald Fitch had not accepted the situation, but had simply moved to a different approach. Benjamin had moved the gun to the kitchen table after supper, when Mae was washing the dishes and he was drying them in the easy domestic rhythm they had fallen into without discussing it, and he had said it quietly. "I think we should stay in tonight, both of us, in the house." And then supper had turned into the 2 of them sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them and the gun on the table, and the Colorado night pressing dark and enormous outside the window, and he had looked at her across the table and said those words that had cracked something open in her chest. "I think I have been waiting for you specifically." The silence after his second saying of it stretched between them like something alive. Mae looked at him for a long time. She felt the full complexity of the moment, the danger outside, the extraordinary intimacy of the 2 of them in the lamplight, the weight of what he had just said and what it meant and what it cost a reserved and careful man to say it. "Benjamin," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both felt it. "I am a person with a past and a debt and no guarantee of anything going forward. I came to this country under false pretenses, and I have been here 5 days, and I do not think you know me well enough to say that." "You're right," he said. "I know you've reorganized 3 years of chaotic accounts in 4 days and haven't complained once. I know you stood in front of a man who was threatening you on a public street and didn't back down an inch. I know you had the sense to leave a dangerous situation without panicking and the presence of mind to find resources in a town you didn't know. I know you look at the land here like it matters to you already." He paused. "And I know that sitting across from you at this table feels more like being home than anything I have felt in 3 years. That might not be knowledge of you specifically, but it's not nothing." Mae felt her throat tighten in a way that was not grief but was very close to its opposite. She looked down at her hands on the table and then back up at him. "Clara," she said, "I want you to know I think about her. I think about you loving someone and losing her, and I don't want to be. I don't want to be a solution to a problem." Something moved through his face, something complex and real. "You're not," he said. "Clara was Clara, and she was irreplaceable, and I will love her until I die, and that is true. And this is also true. I have been so alone, Mae. Not just lonely, which is a smaller thing, but genuinely alone in a way I hadn't let myself fully understand until you walked into the Widow Patton's parlor and spoke to me like a person who expected to be spoken to in return." Mae pressed her lips together and looked at him steadily. I have been running from smallness for a long time, she said. I need you to know that. I need you to know that I am here partly because of necessity, and I am not so romantic that I will pretend otherwise. I wouldn't want you to, he said. But I also, she said, and had to stop and begin again. I also think that what I feel when I'm in this house is different from what I've felt anywhere in years. And I think that is separate from necessity, even though both are true at once. He looked at her across the gun and the lamp and the 5 days of a life beginning to build itself into something, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Will you stay, not just as the person who keeps the books? Will you stay and let us find out what this is?" Outside, a coyote called somewhere in the dark distance, that lonely desert sound that is both desolate and strangely beautiful. And Mae Donnelly, who had spent her whole adult life being sensible and practical, and who had come 1,000 miles to a strange country because she needed a larger life, said, "Yes." The sound of horses on the road came 20 minutes later. Benjamin was on his feet before Mae fully registered the sound, and she was right behind him, and the lamp in the kitchen suddenly seemed dangerously bright. He reached for it and turned it down. In the near dark she could see his profile, absolutely attentive, turned toward the sound. "More than one," he said quietly, "3 or 4. They were not coming fast, which was perhaps worse. Fast would mean recklessness. Slow meant intention. Benjamin moved to the front of the house, and she followed him. He had the ranch hand's bunkhouse connected to the main house by a covered walkway, and he went to the door at the end of the hall and knocked twice in a particular pattern, and the door opened and Casper was there already awake with Tom and Harris behind him, all 3 of them grim-faced and fully dressed. "South Road," Benjamin said quietly. "At least 3. Don't come out unless I call for you. If I call, come fast." He went to the front window and looked out. Mae stood at his shoulder. In the moonlight she could see riders stopping at the edge of the yard. 4 horses, 4 men. One of them was the lean man, and one of them, she was fairly certain even at this distance, was Gerald Fitch himself. "He came himself," she said quietly. "Apparently this has become personal," Benjamin said. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded, if anything, as if the situation had simplified something for him. "Don't go out," Mae said, and then felt herself surprised that she'd said it, surprised at how much she meant it. He looked at her sideways in the dark. "I'm not going to shoot anyone unless I have to," he said, "but I'm also not going to hide in my own house." He took down his rifle from the rack by the front door, checked it in the practiced way of someone who knows his tools, and opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. "Fitch," he said, his voice carried perfectly in the still night air. "This is private property, you know that." "Ralston." The voice from the yard was Fitch's, and even at a distance it carried the carefully modulated authority of a man who has spent years making sure people know he has power. "I've come for what's mine." "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Benjamin said. Mae had moved to the doorway without quite deciding to. She stood at the threshold, not stepping out but not hiding, and when Fitch saw her he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Miss Donnelly," he called, "you've made an unfortunate error in judgment." "Mr. Fitch," Mae said clearly and calmly, "your advertisement was fraudulent and your intentions were predatory. I owe you nothing and I am here by my own choice." "She's employed here legally and she stays here by her own will," Benjamin said. "We've been through this. Whatever argument you think you have, there is no legal or moral basis for it. And coming here in the middle of the night with armed men is the sort of thing the county sheriff will hear about tomorrow morning." There was a long pause from the yard. Mae could feel the tension in it, the way Fitch was calculating, assessing the situation, weighing his options. The lean man's horse shifted and stamped. One of the other riders said something quiet to Fitch that she couldn't hear. Fitch said, "This isn't over, Ralston." "It is for tonight," Benjamin said. "Good night, Gerald." Another long pause, and then the horses turned. Mae watched them until they were back on the road and the sound of hooves had faded entirely, and then she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Benjamin came back inside and set the rifle against the wall and turned to look at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "He'll go to the sheriff," Benjamin said. "And say what?" Mae asked. That you stole something from him, most likely. Something missing from his house that he'll claim you took." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It'll be a lie, but it'll put you in a difficult position." Me felt the cold clarity of this settle over her. "So I need to be proactive." He said quietly. "We do." That word, spoken so simply and so surely, hit her somewhere deep. In the morning they went to town together. Not in the way of two people who were uncertain about what they were, but in the way of two people who have made a quiet decision and are standing behind it. They went to the sheriff's office, which was run by a man named Aldred Purcell, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had the reputation of being slow and steady and basically honest, and who was, Benjamin had told her, not a man that Gerald Fitch had in his pocket, which was apparently a meaningful distinction in Cortez. Me told Sheriff Purcell the complete truth, methodically and without drama. She told him about the advertisement, the letters, Fitch's intentions, her departure, the threats. Benjamin confirmed the timeline and the events at the ranch. Purcell listened without interrupting, which was a good sign in Me's experience. "They were done," he said. "Fitch was in here this morning." "What did he say?" Benjamin asked. "Said Miss Donnelly took a silver watch and a small amount of cash from his house when she left." Purcell looked at me. "I presume you have a response to that." "I took nothing that wasn't mine," Me said. "You're welcome to search my bags, my room, anything in my possession." "I'll also note," Benjamin said, "that Miss Donnelly had her bag with her when she left Fitch's house, and that it contained what she'd brought to town." "Nothing more," Purcell nodded slowly. "Fitch's reputation isn't spotless," he said carefully. "And yours is, Ralston." He looked at me. "I'll look into it. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay at the ranch and let me handle any further approaches from Fitch or his men." They walked out of the sheriff's office into the high, bright Colorado morning, and Me felt something loosen in her chest. Not everything, not the whole weight of it, but enough to breathe a little more freely. Benjamin said, "Breakfast." They went to the hotel dining room, which was less full at this hour, and sat at a small table by the window that looked out at the main street. Me watched the street and the people in it, the horses tied at rails, the women going in and out of the general store, the man repairing a wagon wheel in front of the livery, the ordinary ongoing life of a frontier town that was neither romantic nor ugly, but simply real. "I want to write to a former employer in St. Louis," she said. "A woman named Mrs. Aldrich who ran the school where I taught for 2 years. She could speak to my character in a way that would be difficult to argue with if it came to that." "Good thought," Benjamin said. "Mrs. Harlan at the store also offered to write something. I think she'd do it if asked." "I'll ask her," Me said. She looked at him across the table, this man who had moved so quickly and so quietly into being someone she could rely on, and felt the strangeness and the rightness of it simultaneously. He was watching her with that attentive, unhurried quality she had noticed from the beginning. "How are you?" he asked. Just that. "I'm frightened," she said, because she had decided early on that honesty with him was the foundation of whatever this was, and she intended to maintain it. Not of Fitch exactly, but of how much could still go wrong. "And she paused, "I'm also more settled than I have been in years. Those two things are both true at the same time." He nodded as if this made complete sense to him. "That's an honest answer." "I try to give those," she said. "So do I," he said. "It's more work, but it's easier in the long run." She laughed at that, a real laugh, and he looked at her with something that was almost surprise, as if the sound of her laughing had caught him off guard in a way that pleased him considerably. The weeks that followed were both ordinary and extraordinary, which is perhaps the only way anything that matters can be. Gerald Fitch's accusation came to nothing. Sheriff Purcell investigated with the thoroughness of a man who had been a sheriff long enough to know what a false accusation looked like. And after speaking with Mrs. Harlan and the widow Pat and 3 other people who had observed Me's time in town, had gone to Fitch and told him in plain terms that he was welcome to bring the matter before a judge if he wished, knowing full well that doing so would expose far more about Fitch's conduct than about Me's. Fitch had not pursued it further. The lean man left town. No one knew where he went and no one asked. The accounts at the Sweetwater Ranch came into order with a satisfaction that Mae found genuinely deep. Benjamin had been keeping them with good intentions and poor technique for 3 years, and unwinding the errors and establishing proper systems gave her work that was meaningful and complex, and suited exactly to the way her mind operated. She organized the correspondence, developed a filing system, managed the payroll for the ranch hands, and kept the books with a precision that visibly relieved Benjamin of a burden he'd been carrying for a long time. But it was the evenings that were teaching her the most important things. They had fallen, without discussion, into a pattern of spending the hours after supper together in the main room of the house, reading or talking, or sometimes simply being quiet in the companionable way that grows between people who are becoming known to each other. She learned that he had read everything he could get his hands on since he was a boy, that he had a particular fondness for historical accounts and natural science, that he had opinions about the Ute land situation that were more considered and more sympathetic than most men of his time and position allowed themselves, that he could tell weather by the quality of light on the southern mesa with a reliability that she tested against the actual weather and found to be remarkable. He learned that she had been a reader too, that she loved language, that she had taught herself French from a book because it had seemed useful, and then realized she'd never have anyone to speak it with, which had not stopped her from being glad she knew it. He learned that she was more comfortable being afraid than she was being uncertain, that she preferred a clear problem to an ambiguous situation, and that she cried exactly once in his presence, very quietly, over a letter from her old employer in St. Louis that confirmed everything was well and that Mae had been missed. And when she cried, she turned away to do it and then turned back composed and said, "Sorry." "I'm fine," and he said nothing, which was the right thing. He learned that she liked early mornings better than late evenings, that she was willing to work with her hands as well as her mind, and had offered, casually and competently, to help with anything that needed doing when the accounts were current, and that she had a quality he could only describe as moral seriousness, a sense that she knew exactly what she believed was right and wrong and operated accordingly without making it tiresome. On a Tuesday evening in May, 6 weeks after she had arrived at the Sweetwater Ranch, they were sitting in the main room after supper when he looked up from his newspaper and said, "Ruth comes in July." Mae looked up from her book. "I know," she said. "You mentioned it." "I wanted to say," he said carefully, folding the newspaper into his lap, "that I know it may feel complicated. I want you to know that whatever this is between us, it doesn't require you to be anything to her that you're not. She's a child who misses her father and has learned to manage without her mother, and she doesn't need a new mother assigned to her. She needs people who are honest with her." Mae put her book down entirely. "I think you should know," she said, "that I have been thinking about your daughter since you mentioned her and that I want to meet her very much and that I am not afraid of complicated." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mae," he said. She waited. "I think I should tell you that I am in love with you," he said. "I've thought about whether it's too soon to say, and I've concluded that it isn't, because I think you should know exactly where I stand, and because keeping that knowledge to myself feels like a form of dishonesty, and I've told you I try to avoid those." Mae felt the full force of it land in her chest. She had known, she realized. She had known for some time the way you sometimes know things before you let yourself acknowledge them, and hearing it stated plainly and quietly, and with such complete seriousness, was almost more than she could manage. "Benjamin," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said immediately. "I'm not asking you to. I love you," she said. "I think I have been trying very hard not to because I wasn't sure I had earned it yet, and I understand that is not entirely rational." He looked at her with those river-colored eyes, and something in his face went very still and then very clear like a sky after weather. "You don't have to earn it," he said softly. "It's not that kind of thing." She stood up from her chair and crossed the room and sat beside him on the settee, not touching yet but close, and turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and the lamplight was warm between them, and outside the Colorado night was enormous and full of stars. He took her hand very carefully, the way he handled things he valued, and held it. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, and it was everything. Ruth Ralston arrived on the 5th of July on the train from Denver, a small, serious person of 5 years old with her father's eyes and her mother's mouth, who shook Me's hand when introduced and said, "Papa wrote me about you," in a tone that was entirely neutral and evaluative. "Did he?" Me said. "What did he say?" "He said you were clever and that you didn't complain," Ruth said, apparently still evaluating. "Both mostly true," Me said. Ruth considered this. Then she said, "I want to see the horses." She said this to her father, but she said it looking at me, and me understood that this was an invitation and said, "I'd like to see them too if you'll show me." Ruth showed her the horses. She showed her approximately everything else on the ranch over the following 3 days, with the thoroughness of a child who had been missing this place and who had opinions about all of it. She told me which of the ranch hands were good and which were silly. She told her about a particular spot on the eastern hill where you could see, on very clear days, the outline of a mountain so distant it was almost a ghost. She told her about a bird's nest in the fence post near the creek that she had checked every summer for 3 years. We listened to all of it with complete attention because it all mattered and because this child was offering her something by sharing it. On the 3rd evening of Ruth's visit at supper, Ruth said with the blunt honesty of a 5-year-old, "Are you going to marry Papa?" Benjamin said, "Ruth," in a tone of gentle warning. "It's a reasonable question," Me said. She looked at Ruth across the table. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "We are getting to know each other, your Papa and I. What do you think about that?" Ruth considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Mama's on the hill," she said. "I know," Me said. "I think that's okay," Ruth said. "That Mama's on the hill and you're here. I think you can be different kinds of things." Me looked at this 5-year-old and felt the particular quality of being completely seen and completely accepted by someone who hasn't yet learned to hide what they think, and her eyes burned, and she blinked it back and said, "I think so too." The summer was the best thing Me had experienced in her adult life. The land itself was teaching her daily, the scale of it, the quality of light that changed with every hour, the thunderstorms that built over the southern mesa and rolled in with a drama that was unlike anything she had known in Missouri, the way the prairie grass moved in the wind like something breathing. She learned to ride properly, Benjamin teaching her with the patient clarity he brought to instruction, and she found that she loved it, the particular freedom of being on a horse in open country with nothing between her and the horizon. She wrote long letters to her friend in St. Louis describing the country and received letters back that were full of curious astonishment and vicarious pleasure. She wrote to Ruth's grandparents in Denver, careful and warm letters that were designed to reassure them about their granddaughter's welfare, and which were received with a cautious warmth that gradually became less cautious as the summer went on. She and Benjamin talked about everything. She told him things she had not told anyone in years, about her father and the shop and the debt, about the specific quality of the smallness she had been trying to escape, about the fear that had accompanied her on the train journey west and that she had pushed down and not let herself feel, because feeling it wouldn't have helped. He told her about the years after Clara died, the particular architecture of that grief, the way he had organized himself around the ranch and around Ruth's summers and around the work, because without structure the loss would have been overwhelming. He told her about Ohio, about his own father who had been a difficult and demanding man, about an older brother who had gone to the war in 1864 and not come back, about the way leaving Ohio had been both an escape and a beginning. She noticed that he talked about the past with clarity but not bitterness, which she found extraordinary and admirable, and told him so. "It's not virtue," he said. "It's practicality. Bitterness is expensive and it doesn't pay for anything." In September, Gerald Fitch left Cortez. The specifics were various and complicated, but the essential shape of it was this. A business partner in Denver whom Fitch had defrauded brought legal action, and the case was sufficient to remove Fitch from the community in a way that the other grievances against him had not quite managed. When Mae heard this from Mrs. Harlan at the general store, she felt a vast and uncomplicated relief, the kind you feel when a threat you have been managing quietly for months is simply gone. She went back to the ranch and found Benjamin in the corral and told him. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Good," with a completeness that made her laugh. On a Sunday afternoon in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone entirely gold and the air was sharp and clear, and the southern mesa was purple against a sky of ridiculous blue, Benjamin took her to the eastern hill that Ruth had mentioned, the place where you could see the distant mountain. They sat on the rocky ground at the top of the hill and looked south at a landscape that went on so far it seemed like it would go on forever. "Me," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of practical necessity or because of convention or because of any reason except that I want to spend the rest of my life with you specifically, and I want to be very clear about that." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with a directness that was, as it always was, both slightly overwhelming and profoundly comforting. "Yes," she said. He exhaled in a way that told her he had been more uncertain about her answer than he'd let on, and she filed this knowledge away because it was the kind of thing that was important to know about a person, that his certainty of expression didn't always mean certainty underneath, that he could be vulnerable and careful about showing it. She put her hand on his face, which was the first time she had touched his face, and he went very still. "Yes," she said again. "Very much yes." They were married in November of 1882 in the Cortez church, which was a simple building that had been doing yeoman service for the community for 4 years, and that smelled of pine wood and candle wax. The widow Patton was there. Mrs. Harlan was there. Sheriff Purcell was there, looking pleased in the uncomplicated way of a man who respects when things work out correctly. The ranch hands were there in their best clothes. Ruth was there, having been brought from Denver specifically, wearing a white dress that she had strong opinions about and had apparently chosen herself, and who stood beside me with the gravitas of someone who has taken on a significant role and intends to fulfill it properly. Ruth's grandparents, Clara's parents, were not there in person, but they had sent a letter that Mae had read 3 times because it had said, with a careful generosity that clearly cost them something but that they chose to offer anyway, that they hoped Mae and Benjamin would be happy, and that they were glad Ruth would have a household full of people who loved her. Mae had written back immediately and with great warmth. The ceremony was short and honest. The minister asked the questions and they answered them in clear voices. Benjamin's voice when he said, "I will," was quiet and completely sure, and Mae's when she said her own promise was the same. They put rings on each other's hands, plain gold rings that Benjamin had ordered from Denver, and he held her hand afterward for a long moment with the care he always brought to things that mattered. Outside the church in the cold November air, Ruth took both their hands, one in each of hers, and walked between them back to the wagon, and Mae looked across her daughter's head at her husband and felt something she had been looking for a long time without knowing exactly what it was. Home. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold in the way of Colorado winters, which is comprehensive and unapologetic and beautiful in its severity. The ranch house was warm. They had laid in good stores of wood and provisions. The cattle management through the winter was demanding, keeping the herd healthy through the cold, making sure the water sources didn't freeze entirely, managing the hay supply. Benjamin worked long hours through the worst of it, and Mae worked alongside him in the ways she could, and managed the house and the books in the ways she couldn't. And they were tired in the evenings, but the tiredness of people who have worked well at something that matters is a different kind of tired than the tiredness of people who have spent themselves on nothing. Ruth went back to Denver in early January, a long goodbye that included a detailed written list that she had produced from her coat pocket at the last moment, specifying exactly what she wanted reported to her by letter regarding several specific horses and the bird's nest and other items of importance. Mae had taken the list very seriously and promised to report faithfully. Ruth had studied her face for a moment, and then nodded in the decisive way she had, apparently satisfied. The ranch grew in the spring of 1883. Benjamin had been managing negotiations with a neighboring landowner for several months about a parcel of land to the south that would expand the Sweetwater's grazing range considerably, and the negotiations concluded in April with a handshake agreement that was followed promptly by a proper legal contract. Because Mae had made clear her views on the importance of written contracts, and Benjamin had not only agreed, but had been clearly pleased that someone had organized this principle into the standard operating procedure. There was a moment that spring, early May, when Mae was sitting at the desk in the office going through the quarter's accounts and realized, with a clarity that was both practical and profound, that she was genuinely happy. Not the happiness of relief, not the happiness of having escaped something, but the happiness of a person who has built something real in a place that is genuinely hers, with people she has chosen and who have chosen her. She sat for a moment with this knowledge and let herself feel it completely, which was something she had not always allowed herself. Then she picked up her pen and finished the accounts. She told Benjamin that evening over supper that she was happy. Just like that, plainly. He looked up from his plate and his expression did something she loved, that particular combination of warmth and relief and completeness that she had come to understand meant he had been waiting for her to say it. "Good," he said, and reached across the table and took her hand briefly and then returned to his supper, which was exactly right. In June of 1883, Mae discovered she was expecting a child. She told Benjamin on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them and the window behind him showing the last light on the southern mesa. She said, "I think we are going to need to write to Denver and let Ruth know that she'll have a sibling come winter." He looked at her for 3 full seconds of complete stillness, and then he stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her with the particular careful gentleness that was entirely his own, and she felt him breathe deeply once, and she put her hand on the back of his neck and held him. "A baby," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. Ruth received the letter about the expected sibling with a written response that was 6 sentences long, businesslike, and concluded with the statement that she intended to come for the full summer as planned, and that she hoped the baby would be a boy because she already knew how to deal with herself and a boy would be more educational. Mae read this aloud to Benjamin, and they both laughed until they had to stop. Ruth arrived in July and was immediately intensely interested in the pregnancy in a scientific and supervisory way, asking questions about what Mae needed and making recommendations based on information she had apparently gathered from Clara's mother, whom she consulted by mail on the subject with a thoroughness that was characteristic. The summer of 1883 was full of warmth and work, and the particular sweet heaviness of waiting for something you want. Mae's pregnancy was not easy in the first months, mornings being difficult and energy being less than she was accustomed to, but she managed it with the practicality she brought to everything, and Benjamin managed alongside her in ways that were both pragmatic and tender. He learned, that summer, to make biscuits. The first several batches were not successful. The 5th batch was acceptable. He presented the 5th batch with the modest pride of a man who has conquered a technical problem, and Mae ate one and said, with perfect seriousness, that they were excellent, and he looked at her with the kind of happiness that is almost embarrassingly complete. Ruth, who had observed all of this with great interest, said, "They're better than last time," in a way that was intended to be encouraging, and that made Benjamin laugh. In August, Mae wrote the longest letter she had ever written to her friend in St. Louis, describing everything. The country, the marriage, the ranch, the work, the coming child, all of it. She tried to be accurate and not merely happy, tried to convey the reality of a life that was demanding and sometimes frightening and sometimes exhausting, and was also the largest, most genuinely alive she had ever felt. Her friend wrote back and said she was astonished and glad, and that she was coming to visit the following spring if Mae would have her. Mae wrote back immediately, "Come." On a cold December night in 1883, in the bedroom of the Sweetwater Ranch house, with a competent local midwife named Mrs. Greer, and with Benjamin sitting outside the closed door for 4 hours in a state of concentrated anxiety that he managed by being very still, Mae gave birth to a son. She heard the baby cry and felt the enormous relief of it, the release of something she'd been holding for hours, and Mrs. Greer said, "You have a boy," in a matter-of-fact voice that was nevertheless warm, and Mae said, "Is he well?" And Mrs. Greer said, "He's very well," and brought him to her. She held him, and he was small and furious and real, and she looked at him for a long moment and then asked Mrs. Greer to let Benjamin in. He came in and crossed to the bedside and stood there looking at both of them with the particular expression that some moments produce in a person, and that cannot be accurately described, only recognized. And she held their son up slightly, and he took him with the careful certainty of a man who knows how to hold something precious. They named him James, for her father, and for the honest work of his own. Ruth came for the news at Christmas, bursting through the front door with the barely contained energy of someone who has been waiting a very long time for an event and is determined to evaluate it properly. She held her brother with the gravity of someone who has taken on a serious new responsibility and studied his face with intense attention. "He looks like Papa," she said finally. "He does," Mae agreed. "His hands are very small," Ruth said. "They'll grow," Benjamin said. Ruth considered James for another long moment. Then she said, "I think he'll be all right," in a tone of solemn approval that made both adults exchange a look over her head that was full of love. The winter passed. James grew. The ranch produced well in the spring of 1884. Mae's friend from St. Louis, whose name was Frances Aldrich and who was quick-minded and funny and 28 years old, came in April and spent 3 weeks and went home converted to the opinion that the West was extraordinary and that Mae had done exactly the right thing. "He's wonderful," Frances said quietly to me the night before she left, the two of them sitting on the porch in the cool spring evening while Benjamin read inside. "I mean genuinely wonderful. I've never met anyone quite like him." "No," Mae said. "Neither have I." "How did you know?" Frances asked. The question was not sentimental but genuinely curious, because Frances was the kind of person who wanted to understand how things worked. Mae thought about it honestly. "He said, very early on, that he thought he had been waiting for me specifically," she said. "And I knew that was true because I felt the same way and hadn't found words for it yet. It's that kind of thing." Frances looked at her for a moment and then looked out at the dark Colorado sky, which was doing something extraordinary with the stars. "I want that kind of thing," she said. "You'll find it," Mae said. She was sure of this in the way she was sure of things that were simply true. The years at Sweetwater Ranch built themselves into a life that Mae would not have been able to imagine in the specific when she stepped off the train in Cortez on that April afternoon in 1882, but that she could have imagined in the general if someone had asked her to describe what a real life felt like. It was the life of land and seasons and work and people, of problems solved and problems unsolved and the learning to tell the difference, of growing things in soil and in each other. Benjamin continued to be the most deliberately honest person she had ever known. He continued to be tender with the things he loved in a way that did not diminish him, which she had learned was rarer in men than it should have been. He continued to have opinions about books and about the land and about what was right, and they argued sometimes, good arguments, the kind that end in both people understanding something they didn't before, and sometimes they didn't argue and simply held different views on a thing and were fine with that too. In 1885, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, because Mae had suggested it and Benjamin had been very still for a moment and then said yes. And Ruth had come for the birth, and held her sister with the serious dedication of a person who has decided that this particular responsibility is the most important one currently available. And James, at 2 years old, had looked at the new baby with approximately the same expression he brought to most things, which was a calm and considering interest that Mae was fairly certain was going to be his defining quality for life. Ruth, who was 8 now, lived primarily in Denver with her grandparents during the school year because the school there was better. But she came every summer and every Christmas and spent as much time at Sweetwater as could be managed. And Mae and Clara's parents had arrived at a relationship of genuine mutual respect and warmth, built over letters and visits, that gave Ruth the wholeness of knowing she was loved fully in both places. In 1886, Mae took on the teaching position at the Cortez school that had been offered to her 4 years earlier. She taught 3 days a week and managed the ranch books the other 2, and she found that teaching was as satisfying as it had always been when she had sufficient pay and sufficient respect from the people who ran the school, both of which she now had. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography, and she taught with the rigor and the genuine interest in her students that made good teachers rare and valuable. Benjamin expanded the herd and the operation. He hired more hands and managed them with the fairness he had always brought to that work. He was known in the community as an honest dealer and a reliable neighbor, the kind of man whose word meant something and who showed up when showing up was needed, who had helped 3 different neighboring families through difficult times in ways that asked nothing in return. Mae watched this quality of him with a steady love that did not diminish with familiarity, but that deepened as she came to understand it more fully. In 1887, on an October evening very much like the October evening 5 years earlier when he had asked her to marry him, they sat on the hill where Ruth had first said you could see the distant mountain, and the cottonwoods were gold again, and the air was sharp, and the sky was the particular deep blue of high-altitude autumn. James was 4 and running in circles around the base of the hill with the inexhaustible energy of a small boy who had been kept still on the wagon ride and was making up for it. Clara, who was 2, was on Benjamin's lap with great satisfaction, having organized herself against his chest and fallen nearly asleep. Ruth, who was 10 and spending a long weekend at the ranch between school terms, was sitting slightly apart from them reading a book but participating in the gathering with the comfortable assumption of someone who belongs where they are. Mae looked at the distant mountain and at the golden valley and at the wide sky and felt the full, specific, unrepeatable rightness of this particular moment in this particular life. Benjamin looked at her. She felt his gaze and turned to look back at him. Clara had fully fallen asleep in his lap. James was still running circles. Ruth turned a page. "Are you still happy?" he asked. He asked it with the same directness she had always valued in him, with no assumption in it, just the genuine desire to know. "Completely," she said. He reached across and took her hand, not briefly this time but for a while, and they sat watching the light change on the distant mountain until James came up the hill and wanted to know what they were looking at and whether the mountain had bears. "Probably," Benjamin said seriously. "I want to see a bear," James announced. "Someday," Mae said. "Tomorrow." James said, "Not tomorrow," Mae said. "The day after tomorrow." Benjamin made a sound that was caught between parental seriousness and laughter, and Mae looked at him, and they were both entirely failing to be stern. And James took this as a yes and went back to running his circles, and the golden afternoon continued exactly as it was. In the spring of 1888, the school board in Cortez asked me if she would consider taking on the position of head teacher, managing the school full-time and overseeing a second teacher they intended to hire. She sat with this offer for 2 days before bringing it to Benjamin, not because she needed his permission, but because she wanted to think through it with him. They talked about it for a long evening at the kitchen table, going through the practical implications with the thoroughness they brought to significant decisions, the time it would require, the change to her current balance of school and ranch work, what it would mean for the ranch books and how they could manage that differently. At the end of it, Benjamin said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to do it." He said, "Then do it." She said, "It means me." He said, "I know what it means. I'll hire someone to help with the books, or I'll do them myself, or we'll find another way. What you do matters to this community, and it matters to you, and both of those are reasons enough." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight that had been the witness to so many of their important conversations, this kitchen, this table, this lamp between them, and she said, "I love you very much, you know." "I know," he said. "I love you very much too." He said it simply, in the way he had always said important things, without flourish and without doubt. She took the position. The school grew under her management. The second teacher arrived, a young woman from Albuquerque named Miss Vega, who was excellent, and whom he mentored with the care of someone passing on something valuable. The school served more children as more families settled in the area, and me taught with rigor and compassion, and the conviction that education was one of the most important things one person could offer another. In 1889, their third child was born, another son. They named him Henry, and James, who was 6, took to this new sibling with the considered interest that was his way, and Clara at 4 was initially skeptical and then deeply invested, and Ruth came for the birth, though it meant missing school, because some things, she informed her grandparents in the letter requesting permission to travel, were more important than the regular schedule. The Sweetwater Ranch celebrated the new year of 1890 with a gathering of neighbors and friends that filled the large main room of the ranch house to comfortable capacity. The widow Patton was there. Mrs. Harlan was there. Sheriff Purcell, now retired and replaced by a younger man, was there with his wife. Several of the neighboring ranch families were there, people me had come to know over 8 years as neighbors and then as friends. Ruth was 17 by that year, a serious and thoughtful young woman who had been accepted to a school for women in Denver that offered real academic training, and who was going in the fall with the support of both her father and her grandparents and me, who had been writing letters of encouragement and book recommendations to her for years. That New Year's evening, when the celebration was winding down and the children were asleep and the last guests had gone, me and Benjamin sat at the kitchen table as they so often did, with the lamp burning between them and the new decade outside the window. He had aged beautifully, she thought. The lines in his face were the lines of someone who had spent years looking at wide landscapes and laughing genuinely and grieving honestly and working hard, and they made him more himself rather than less. She supposed the same was probably true of her, though she thought about her own face less than she thought about his. 8 years, he said, looking at the lamp rather than at her, in the way he sometimes did when he was thinking something through. 8 years, she confirmed. He looked up at her. "If I could do them again, I wouldn't change a thing. I would change the Gerald Fitch part," she said. He laughed. "The Gerald Fitch part," he conceded, "I would also change." "But not what came after it," she said. "No," he said, "never what came after." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, this table where she had first heard him say the thing that had cracked her open, where their whole life together had begun to take shape in the amber lamplight of a threatened night that had turned into a beginning. "I think I am still waiting for you," she said, "in the sense that I think every day is still finding out who you are. I don't think it ends." He turned his hand over under hers and held it. "No," he said, "I don't think it ends." Outside, the first night of 1890 was enormous and cold and full of stars, the Colorado sky doing what it always did, which was remind human beings of their proper scale without being unkind about it. The ranch was dark and quiet. The cattle were settled in the winter pasture. The children were asleep in their rooms. Ruth was asleep in her old room, her books stacked beside the bed. The creek ran in its cold, dark course. The mesa to the south was invisible, but was there, as it always was, that great purple fact of the land. In the spring of that year, a letter arrived that required careful navigation. It was from Clara's parents in Denver. the grandparents who had loved Ruth and cared for her through so many school years. And the letter said that Ruth's grandfather had died of a heart attack in February, quietly and without suffering, and that Ruth's grandmother, whose name was Edith, was now alone in the Denver house and was managing but was lonely, and the letter asked, very carefully and with evident effort, whether there might be room at the Sweetwater Ranch for an old woman who missed her granddaughter and who would, the letter said, try not to be any trouble. Mae read the letter twice. Then she went and found Benjamin in the south pasture and gave it to him and watched him read it. He folded it and looked at the horizon for a moment. There's room, he said. I know, Mae said. You're sure I loved Clara through her portrait and her daughter and your grief, Mae said. I am not at all at odds with her mother. If anything, I should very much like to know her. He looked at her with that expression she had known for 8 years and would know for the rest of her life, that combination of warmth and relief and completeness. I'll write to her today, he said. Edith Granger arrived in May, a small, compact woman of 63 with Ruth's eyes and a manner that was carefully restrained in the beginning, feeling her way into a situation that she was grateful for and uncertain about in equal measure. Mae made the certainty unnecessary as quickly as she could, through the straightforward warmth that she had learned was more effective than any amount of careful maneuvering. She showed Edith the ranch with honest pride. She gave her Ruth's old room, which had a view of the eastern hill. She asked Edith to tell her about Clara, and listened to the answer with the respect and genuine interest that made Edith cry once and then straighten and say, "Thank you for asking," in a voice that was both grateful and surprised. Edith became part of the household in the gradual way of people who find their place through being genuinely useful and genuinely present. She was excellent with the children, and they loved her. She was good company in the evenings and had strong opinions about books. She and Benjamin were careful and warm with each other, navigating something that required care, and after a few months they had found a footing that was comfortable and real, something like a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law, which was perhaps the nearest available category, though it was not quite right. Ruth came for the summer and found her grandmother in her old room and her father reading on the porch and Mae at the schoolwork. She still brought home in evenings, and her brothers running in the yard and her sister studying something that involved a great deal of dirt. And she stood in the yard for a moment after coming down from the wagon and took it all in. "Good," she said, with great satisfaction. It was the best word she had for it, and it was exactly right. In the fall of 1891, Ruth left for Denver and her academic school, and the Sweetwater Ranch went into the comfortable rhythms of another winter, this time with one more person at the table and one more voice in the evenings. Edith's steady presence, something that Mae had not known she would value so much, and that she found she valued enormously. James was 8, and reading everything he could find and asking questions that required research to answer properly. Clara was 6, and had developed a consuming interest in the natural world that Mae encouraged with the conviction that scientific curiosity in a girl was to be nurtured rather than redirected. Henry was 2, and the most physically energetic of the 3, which kept everyone in constant low-level alert. Mae sat at the kitchen table on a February evening of that winter, after the children were asleep and Edith had gone to her room, and the house was quiet, and she thought about the particular texture of this life, the density of it, how many people were contained in it, and how much love it held without seeming to strain. Benjamin came in from checking the stock and came to the table and poured himself coffee and sat across from her and looked at her in the warm, steady way that had not changed in 9 years, that had in fact deepened in a way that felt like something being built up rather than worn down. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "I'm thinking about that first night," she said. "The lamp, the gun on the table, what you said." He was quiet, remembering it. "I think I have been waiting for you specifically," she said, using his words back to him. He smiled at that, the full, genuine smile that she still found entirely disarming. "Did I know what I was saying?" he said. "I think you knew exactly what you were saying," she said. "That was what was frightening about it. Were you frightened? Not of you, she said, of wanting it to be true. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his and held it in the careful way he had always held things that mattered. Is it true? He said. She looked at him, this man who had been her harbor and her partner and her daily companion and her truest friend for 9 years, who had built something with her in this land that was genuinely large and genuinely hers, who had taught her that the love she had been looking for was not a smaller thing than she had imagined but a larger and more ordinary and more extraordinary thing than she had known how to picture. Yes, she said, it's true. The lamp burned between them as it always had, steady and warm in the February dark. Outside, the Colorado night held its stars and its cold and its enormous beautiful indifference. Inside the Sweetwater Ranch house, in the kitchen, at the table where it had all begun, two people who had found each other at the exact right moment in the exact right place sat together and were home. The spring came, as it always did, with the high desert certainty of a land that has been renewing itself for longer than human memory. The grass came green along the creek banks. The cattle moved to the spring pasture. The school in Cortez opened its windows to let in the warm air, and the sound of children playing in the yard between lessons. The bird's nest in the fence post near the creek, which James had taken over monitoring from Ruth, had eggs in it, which he reported at supper with the solemnity of a scientist presenting significant findings. Clara wanted to see them and was convinced by me, with some effort, to wait until the birds hatched before approaching more closely. Henry, who was now 3, said he wanted a horse of his own, and Benjamin took him to the corral and showed him a small quiet mare that was safe for children, and let him feed her an apple from his palm. And Henry stood very still with the apple in his hand and his eyes very large, and the mare took it with the gentle precision that horses bring to this transaction, and Henry turned around with a face full of wonder that was one of the finest things me had witnessed in recent memory. She laughed at it, a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from being full of something good, and Benjamin looked at her from across the corral with those river-colored eyes that were the particular eyes she would recognize across any distance, and he smiled, and it was enough. It was entirely, specifically, abundantly enough. That was the truth that Mae Donnelly had come 1,000 miles to find, though she hadn't known it when she packed her bag in St. Louis and stepped toward a train and a strange country and a life larger than the one she had. The truth was not that love was a rescue or a solution. The truth was that it was a choosing made again every day of a person and a place and a life, with your whole self and your clear eyes open. It was the thing that had been waiting on the other side of the fear, past the false advertisement and the dangerous man and the gun on the table and the lamp burning in the dark. It was Benjamin Ralston saying, with the complete and quiet certainty of a man who had waited long enough to know, I think I have been waiting for you specifically. And it was Mae Donnelly knowing in the cracked open place in her chest that she had been waiting too, that the waiting was over, that they were here.